My name is Emily, and I'm 34 years old. A few nights ago, I told my husband, Jake, that there were men in my DMs who would treat me better than he ever did. Bold move, right? Well, Jake didn't yell, didn't argue, he just walked out. And now, I'm sitting alone in the apartment we once shared, drowning in bills, wondering how I got here. Let me backtrack a bit. I met Jake 7 years ago at a restaurant called the Copper Lodge in Austin, Texas. I was a waitress, and he was the head chef. He had this presence on the line, commanding without being a jerk. Jake was 42, divorced, no kids, and nothing like the guys I had dated before. He had his life together, no drama, no games. I knew he was different the day I accidentally screwed up an order. Instead of tearing into me like most chefs would, he calmly fixed it and said, "Happens to the best of us." Things escalated from there. He'd leave me little taste tests of new recipes he was working on, and before long, we were dating. It wasn't fireworks and chaos like my previous relationships, but it was steady. Safe. Jake wasn't big on social media, which clashed with my life. I was trying to grow a following on Instagram because I dreamed of becoming a beauty influencer. He didn't really get it, but he never stopped me either. 2 years in, we got married. The wedding wasn't exactly my dream Pinterest vineyard extravaganza. Jake kept talking about budgets and practicality, so we ended up in a cute garden restaurant instead. It was nice, but every time I saw my friends post their lavish weddings on Facebook, I felt that sting of envy. Shortly after we got married, Jake was promoted to district manager. It came with more money but also more responsibilities, longer hours, more stress. He'd come home too exhausted to do much more than eat and watch Netflix. Around that time, I decided to quit waitressing and focus full-time on building my beauty brand. We could afford it now, right? Except Jake didn't exactly celebrate when I told him. He didn't say no, he never did, but there was that look. You know, the look that says, "I'm not gonna fight you on this, but I have concerns." I poured everything into my dream. High-end products, professional photography equipment. You can't be taken seriously with drugstore makeup, after all. But while I was out buying ring lights and booking photo shoots, Jake was quietly handling the bills, watching as our credit card balances climbed. He started making little comments, like, "Do you really need another palette?" And it wasn't long before I noticed the contrast between our lives and those of other influencers. Their husbands were building them home studios, taking them on luxury vacations, buying them designer bags. And here I was, excited when Jake agreed to splurge on a takeout order of sashimi instead of just California rolls. The tension built. I found my tribe in a group of fellow beauty influencers, women whose husbands seemed to worship the ground they walked on. One of them, Brianna, became my closest friend. Her husband, Nate, built her a whole photography studio in their basement without blinking. "Jake's holding you back," she'd say over our endless wine nights. I started believing her. I won't lie, the DMs from random guys boosted my ego. They'd comment on my posts, telling me how beautiful and talented I was, how lucky my husband must be. Jake saw a few of those messages one night when I showed him a makeup look I was proud of. He got weird about it, suggested I make my account private. I snapped back that he was insecure and didn't understand how engagement works on social media. It all came to a head one night after a particularly heated argument about money. Jake had brought up the fact that I'd spent $3,000 on makeup and equipment in just 2 months. In a fit of frustration, I showed him my DMs, messages from men who said they'd support my dreams without hesitation. "These guys get it," I said. "Why can't you?" The look on his face. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment. He just walked away without saying a word. I felt vindicated at the time. I posted a glamorous selfie with a caption about knowing your worth. The comments and DMs flooded in, hundreds of people telling me how strong and inspiring I was. But Jake's silence haunted me. He stopped asking about my business, stopped checking in. His side of the closet started emptying out slowly. I didn't even notice until it was nearly bare. Then came the night I saw him packing the last of his things. I confronted him, still riding high on ego and wine. "You're really leaving over a few DMs?" I scoffed. But Jake didn't argue. He handed me his phone instead. There were screenshots, my Instagram stories mocking our marriage, private messages to Brianna where I complained about how boring and unsupportive he was. There was even a voice note I'd sent laughing about how I had Jake wrapped around my finger. That's when he showed me the plans for a home studio he'd secretly been organizing. Contractors had been lined up for months. It was supposed to be a surprise. I could have apologized. Should have begged him to stay. Instead, I doubled down. "You should have communicated better," I snapped. Jake just shook his head. "You've explained plenty on Instagram," he said quietly before walking out the door. The next few weeks were a blur of Instagram posts about leveling up and removing negativity from my life. The support was overwhelming, at first. But reality hit hard. Jake had been covering more than I realized. Bills piled up. My credit cards maxed out. The men in my DMs weren't offering to pay for my overdue rent. The final blow came when I saw a photo on Instagram. Jake was in Chicago, smiling with a woman named Rachel. She owned several restaurants and had that effortless glow about her. They looked happy. Happier than I'd ever seen him. Now, here I am, sitting in my car after a double shift at a chain restaurant, scrolling through Instagram. I've got 3 DMs from guys saying they treat me better. But I know what that really means now. Funny how life works. I had a husband who quietly paid off my debts and tried to build a future for us. I traded it all for validation from strangers on the internet. And now? Now I'm just another cautionary tale. Tomorrow, I'll post something about new beginnings. But tonight, I'll sit here and let myself feel the weight of everything I've lost. I don't even know how long I sat in that parking lot, my phone screen glowing faintly in the dark. My fingers hovered over the Instagram app, but for once, I couldn't bring myself to post anything. What was I going to say? That I was thriving? That I was embracing the hustle? The truth was, I was exhausted, emotionally, financially, physically. It's funny how social media makes you believe that the world owes you something just because people give you attention. But when the bills start coming in, attention doesn't pay your rent. And when you're really struggling, those "you got this, queen" messages don't mean a damn thing. Eventually, I forced myself to drive home to my tiny, dimly lit apartment. I kicked off my shoes and flopped onto the couch, staring at the ceiling. Jake used to hate this couch. Said it was uncomfortable and that we needed to replace it. I had fought him on that, too. Now it was all I had left. The next morning, I woke up to another round of overdraft notifications. My phone was practically screaming at me with red exclamation marks from my bank app. I sighed, pulled on my work uniform, and headed out. It was a double shift again. I had to make rent somehow. At the restaurant, I was in the weeds from the moment I clocked in. Lunch rush hit hard, and every table had something to complain about. I plastered on a fake smile, but it cracked when I recognized a couple at table 6. They had followed me on Instagram for years. I could see the confusion on their faces as they whispered to each other. "She used to post all those makeup tutorials," I overheard the woman say, trying to keep her voice low. "What's she doing working here?" I wanted to crawl under the nearest booth and disappear. After my shift, I was too tired to cry. I drove to a nearby park, found a quiet bench, and just sat there, watching the world go by. Parents played with their kids. Couples strolled hand in hand. And here I was, alone, with nothing but regrets and mounting debt to keep me company. I thought about Jake again. About the studio he had tried to build for me. About the quiet sacrifices he had made while I was too distracted by DMs and designer palettes to notice. I wondered if he thought of me at all now, or if he had moved on completely with Rachel. I pulled out my phone and, for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't open Instagram. Instead, I opened my notes app and started writing, not for likes, not for comments, but for myself. Things I need to fix. Get control of my finances. Stop chasing validation from strangers. Learn to appreciate the people who actually care. The list wasn't long, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, I kept my head down. I cut back on social media, posted only when I had something genuine to share. I even reached out to a financial advisor to help me set up a repayment plan for my debt. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt real. One day, out of nowhere, Brianna texted me. She wanted to meet up. I almost didn't reply, but curiosity got the better of me. We met at a coffee shop we used to frequent. She was still living her influencer life, still posting luxury hauls and brunch selfies, but something was off. Her usual sparkle seemed dimmed. We caught up, danced around the topic of my marriage until she finally blurted it out. "Nate left," she said quietly, stirring her latte. I thought everything was perfect, but he said he was tired of being a prop in my online life. I didn't say, "I told you so." I knew too well how much that kind of loss hurt. We sat in silence for a while before she admitted, "I miss when things were simpler, you know? Before all this pressure." "Yeah," I replied. "I do." After that, we talked more honestly than we had in years. About the anxiety that comes with living your life under a microscope. About the loneliness that creeps in when you're chasing perfection. We didn't solve all our problems that day, but it felt good to be real again. Little by little, life started to stabilize. I still had a long way to go, but I was making progress. I booked a few makeup gigs, not from Instagram, but through word of mouth. I focused on building trust with my clients instead of chasing clout. And while my following continued to shrink, the people who stayed were the ones who truly supported me. One evening, months later, I received a message I didn't expect. It was from Jake's sister, Katie. It was brief but kind. "Hey, just wanted to say I'm proud of how you're turning things around. Hope you're doing okay." I stared at the message for a long time before replying. "Thanks. I'm getting there." I didn't ask about Jake. I didn't need to. For the first time, I understood that healing wasn't about winning someone back. It was about finding peace within yourself. That night, I posted a simple update. Sometimes the hardest part of growth is facing the truth about yourself. But the journey is worth it. There were no hashtags, no filters. Just honesty. The comments trickled in slowly but meaningfully. And for once, I didn't care about the numbers. I went to bed that night feeling lighter than I had in years. Maybe I'd never be a mega influencer. Maybe my dreams would look different than I had imagined. But that was okay. I was finally living for myself, not for the likes, not for the validation, but for me. And that, I realized, was more than enough. The following morning, I woke up to something I hadn't expected in a long time: peace. Not the fake peace that comes from a carefully curated life online, but real, grounded peace. The kind where you're no longer afraid of your own thoughts or the silence that fills your apartment. I didn't rush to check my phone, didn't care about notifications or DMs. I just lay there for a while, letting the sunlight filter through the curtains. Later that day, I went for a walk downtown, stopping by some of my old favorite spots. It felt like I was rediscovering the world outside of the digital bubble I'd been trapped in. I passed by the boutique I used to dream about partnering with when I was still obsessed with becoming Emily the beauty influencer. It was funny how distant that dream seemed now. While walking, I got another message from Jake's sister. This time, it was a picture, a candid shot of Jake teaching a group of kids how to cook at a community center. He looked happy. Genuinely happy. The woman beside him, Rachel, stood by with a clipboard in hand, smiling like she was part of his world, not competing with it. I stared at the photo for a while. It hurt, but not in the same gut-wrenching way it used to. It wasn't jealousy anymore, it was more like acceptance. Jake had moved on. He'd found someone who fit into the life he wanted, and he deserved that. I couldn't begrudge him happiness when I knew deep down I hadn't made him happy. That night, I found myself reflecting on the version of me he had fallen in love with. She was ambitious, sure, but she also had heart. She didn't need validation from strangers. Somewhere along the way, I had lost her. Maybe it wasn't too late to find her again. Over the next few months, I worked harder on myself than I ever had on my social media presence. I got promoted to floor supervisor at the restaurant and started taking evening courses on business management. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was finally learning how to manage money and responsibility, the very things Jake had tried to teach me years ago. But I wasn't doing it for him. I was doing it for me. My financial situation improved little by little. I paid off one credit card, then another. It was a slow grind, but with each bill I cleared, I felt like I was shedding another layer of the person I used to be, the one who thought life was all about appearances. One weekend, I booked a makeup client who had found me through a mutual friend. It wasn't a wedding this time, it was just a woman who wanted to feel beautiful for herself. As I worked on her makeup, we talked about life, love, and self-worth. She told me about her struggles with confidence, how she'd always felt like she wasn't enough. "You're not alone," I said softly, blending highlighter onto her cheekbone. "We've all been there." She looked in the mirror when I was done and smiled, not the kind of smile you force for photos, but a real one. "Thank you," she whispered. "I needed this." When she left, I sat in my little makeshift studio, just a folding chair, a vanity, and a ring light, and realized something profound. This is what I'd always wanted. Not the fame, not the sponsorships, but moments like this. Real connections. Real impact. By the time I reached the 1-year mark since Jake left, I felt like a different person. The scars were still there, but they didn't define me anymore. I had learned to find joy in the small victories, like finishing a shift without collapsing from exhaustion or having a week where all my bills were paid on time. One evening, I finally made the decision to reach out to Jake. Not to get him back, but to thank him. I sent a simple email. "Hey, Jake. I just wanted to say thank you, for everything you did for me, even when I didn't see it. I'm sorry for how things ended between us. I hope you're doing well. Take care." I didn't expect a reply, and honestly, I didn't need one. But a few days later, he did respond. "Emily, thanks for reaching out. I'm glad to hear you're doing better. I wish you the best. Take care of yourself." It wasn't much, but it was closure. That night, I lit a candle, poured myself a glass of wine, not the expensive kind I used to flaunt online, but something simple and comforting, and toasted to myself. I had been through hell, made mistakes I'd never forget, but I had survived. More than that, I had grown. Life wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. It was mine, and that was more than enough. A few days later, as I closed up after a late shift, I found myself sitting outside the restaurant, the night air cool and quiet around me. I didn't have anywhere to rush off to, no notifications pulling me in every direction. I just sat there with my thoughts, calm for once, reflecting on how much had changed. It wasn't just about losing Jake anymore. I had lost the illusion I built around myself. The idea that being Emily the influencer would fill every void in my life. But I'd gained something so much more valuable, understanding who I really was beneath the filters, the curated captions, and the endless search for approval. As I walked to my car, I spotted a couple sitting on a bench nearby, laughing softly as they shared a late-night snack. I didn't feel bitter or envious. For the first time, I simply smiled and kept moving, content in knowing that my happiness wasn't tied to anyone else's timeline or definition. Over the next few weeks, my routines became quieter, more purposeful. I found joy in the little things, meal prepping on Sunday afternoons, morning walks before shifts, and reading at night instead of endlessly scrolling through social media. I allowed myself the space to breathe, to rebuild a life grounded in things that mattered. One day, I received a message from a former follower who had noticed my posts had become less frequent but more meaningful. "You're inspiring me in a different way now," she wrote. "Thank you for showing that growth isn't always glamorous. You helped me feel less alone." That message stuck with me. Maybe I wasn't destined to be the beauty mogul I once dreamed of, but I was still having an impact, quietly, authentically. That was enough for me. Months passed, and one warm spring evening, I decided to take a solo drive out to a scenic overlook Jake and I used to visit back when we first started dating. I hadn't been there in years. I parked, sat on the hood of my car, and watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. For a moment, I let myself think of him, not with regret, but with gratitude. He had taught me lessons I hadn't been ready to learn back then, but now, I could honor them in my own way. I whispered a quiet thank you to the universe, for the pain, for the mistakes, and for the strength that had come from them. The next morning, I woke up with a new sense of purpose. I had ideas, real ones, not fantasies of instant success. I wanted to slowly build a small business offering personal makeup sessions for women like the client I'd helped before. I drafted a plan, contacted a few people for advice, and started setting realistic goals. Every step forward felt solid, like I was walking on a foundation I had built for myself. A year after that fateful night when Jake walked out, I was no longer just surviving, I was thriving in a quieter, more sustainable way. The noise of social media had faded to the background. The validation I used to crave? It didn't matter anymore. The people who stayed in my life were real, and so was I. And so, on a lazy Sunday afternoon, I found myself at my small but growing studio, helping a new bride get ready for her wedding. As I applied the finishing touches to her makeup, she beamed at her reflection. "You have no idea how much this means to me," she said softly. I smiled back. "I think I do." When she left, I cleaned up and sat for a moment in the quiet, letting the satisfaction of a job well done wash over me. This was success, not the flashy kind, but the deeply personal kind that comes from knowing you're exactly where you need to be. I stood up, stretched, and glanced out the window at the life I had rebuilt. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, I knew, without a doubt, that I was finally at peace. The end.